To the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Gordon Hahn writes at gordonhahn.com, cracks in NATO's Ukraine project. Cracks are emerging in NATO's anti-Russian alliance centered on Ukraine. NATO's Vilnius summit exposed growing tensions between NATO members and between them and their Ukrainian client state as a result of growing risks of defeat in their proxy war. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So Hahn continues, these tensions are destined to grow as Kiev's position on the front continues to deteriorate. In Kiev, signs of panic and the likelihood of rising civil-military tensions pose the grave threat to the West's plans to deal Russia a strategic defeat and to prompt Putin's removal. Western and Ukrainian hopes and expectations have been unrealistic all the way around from the start. That last sentence, that these expectations have been unrealistic all the way around from the start, I'll say, yeah, duh to that. Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, that is the understatement of the century. However, there's been so many fundamental misconceptions by the NATO bloc led by U.S. imperialism that it's difficult to know where to start. For example, take the conflation between the Soviet regime and the post-Soviet regime exemplified by Mr. Putin. That is a gross mischaracterization because one of the aspects of the Soviet regime, which the U.S. imperialists have chosen to ignore, is that their leadership, particularly the Gorbachev leadership, to look at it charitably, were so bent on building bridges to U.S. imperialism that they misinterpreted and misread U.S. imperialism. For example, this idea that NATO would not expand 1 inch given German reunification, for example. And that was not put in writing, and so therefore it was basically a worthless promise. You could say particularly that perhaps the Gorbachev leadership was intimidated by Star Wars and by U.S. imperialism's threat fundamentally to blow up the world. And you see a precursor of that with the Nikita Khrushchev leadership, which in October 1962 settled the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis, that is to say, Moscow putting defensive missiles in Cuba to protect against the U.S. invasion. The settlement involved the U.S. withdrawing its missiles from Turkey and making a pledge to not invade Cuba. But the Khrushchev leadership, perhaps like its successor, Gorbachev, was so bent on building bridges to U.S. imperialism that they chose to keep the U.S. concessions private, which then made it appear as if Washington had stared down the Ruskies, as they said during the time. And then that came back to haunt President Johnson, who was caught on tape suggesting that he had to stand tall in Vietnam because he wanted to emulate the President Kennedy. Obviously, he wasn't let in on the details of the deal that settled the Cuban crisis. And it's apparent that, once again, U.S. imperialism had thought that they could do the same thing with Mr. Putin that they had done with Gorbachev and Khrushchev. Obviously, that didn't work. Obviously, if Mr. Biden had made a pledge in early February 2022 that came out of the Vilnius, Lithuania summit in July 2023, that is to say, no clear path to NATO membership by Ukraine, perhaps if that had been articulated clearly in February 2022, this whole conflict could have been avoided. But because, I guess, to look at U.S. imperialism in the most benign light, that they thought that they believed their own rhetoric. They were eating their own dog food. Apparently, they actually believed that there was a conflation between the Soviet regime and the post-Soviet regime, but obviously that's not the case. Mr. Putin was not joshing, he was not playing around, and Washington has come to realize that to its detriment. And now the latest victim of this catastrophe is the leader of the military in Great Britain. Speaking of Ben Wallace, he was more hawkish, believe it or not, than the Pentagon on this conflict. It's perhaps a good sign that he has now chosen to resign, or perhaps he was thrown overboard before he jumped overboard. And that betrays the shambles on which U.S. policy towards Ukraine and UK policy towards Ukraine finds itself. And then there's the deal with Turkey, which I'm afraid to tell President Erdogan that don't count your chickens before they're hatched, because this getting fighter jets from U.S. has to overcome a hurdle from the U.S. Senate and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But in any case, if that deal goes through, it'll only create more contradictions, because part of the trade-off apparently was more visa-free access for Turkey to enter the European Union. And given Turkey's more than warm relations with religious zealots, particularly those who have been bedeviling Syria in recent years, this will cause more conflict in the EU bloc, perhaps helping to worsen the already horrible situation concerning Islamophobia, particularly the Federal Republic of Germany, which houses a substantial Turkish minority, particularly in France, which has pre-existing tensions with Turkey in any case. And if I were the leaders in Israel, I would lobby furiously against Mr. Erdogan getting these jets, given the fraught relations between Turkey and Israel. And reference here, of course, the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, is having difficulty getting an invitation to the White House to engage in that kind of lobbying, which obviously portends even more conflict. The ultimate victor, as ever, with regard to U.S. imperialism, is the military-industrial complex, which will be cashing Turkish checks for those fighter jets, not to mention the fact that with Washington pressing the EU nations to spend 2% of GDP on the military, that means more checks passing into the coffers of Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and Boeing, allowing them to buy more, allowing the executives at least to buy more mini mansions in Bethesda and Silver Springs, Maryland, and Falls Church, Virginia.
In his Mr. Hahn in his article "Cracks in NATO's Ukraine Project," one of the things he talks about is the growing tension between NATO members and their Ukrainian client. And I immediately thought of the infamous picture from the NATO summit where the members of NATO, the ruling elite of Europe, was, you know, they were milling about and speaking and having fun, and poor old Vladimir Zelensky was in a green janitor's uniform, standing off to the side. Your thoughts?
Well, clearly, Mr. Zelensky did not win friends and influence people with his Twitter tirade in Vilnius, objecting to this elongated process by which Ukraine, sometime down the road, perhaps in this century, perhaps beyond, will join NATO. I would urge and encourage Mr. Zelensky to tighten his security. U.S. imperialism has been known to throw overboard, quite literally, so-called allies who become difficult allies. And we already know that there have been a number of assassination attempts against Mr. Zelensky, per usual. They're being laid at the doorstep of Moscow. But if any of these assassination attempts wind up being successful, there are so many potential culprits, one does not know where to begin. I mean, first of all, of course, there's U.S. imperialism. Second of all, of course, is the erstwhile Ukrainian ally in Poland. Reference here, the pre-existing tensions going back to World War II involving neo-Nazis in Poland and neo-Nazis in Ukraine, for example. And that's not even to get into the internal antagonist of Mr. Zelensky in Ukraine itself. It's no secret that many in the military in Ukraine were not enthusiastic about launching this long-awaited counteroffensive which is actually turning into a Russian offensive. And that speaks the tensions between the civilian leadership and the military leadership. If you go further west into Ukraine, in the city of Lviv, for example, which had been a hotbed of neo-Nazi sentiment for quite a long time, you'll see that many are not happy by the fact that as we speak, youth are being grabbed by the collar and frog marched into the to the Ukrainian military, where they become cannon fodder in useless offensives against the Russian forces. So you are correct to point out that Mr. Zelensky has burned a number of bridges, and like a Agatha Christie mystery novel, if he goes down for the count, there will be so many culprits we will not know where to begin to find them.
Popular Resistance has a piece entitled "Arming Taiwan is an Insane Provocation." Taiwan is but one in a series of islands along the Chinese coast, often called the First Island Chain, which now bristles with advanced U.S. weapons. One of the things that I've been trying to figure out as it relates to the United States strategy in terms of Taiwan, understanding that Taiwan has elections in either January or February of 24, is what's the U.S. strategy here? Is the U.S. doing this anticipating a conflict with China before the election? Or is the United States so convinced that it can surreptitiously impact the election that arming Taiwan now won't matter? Because if the forces, the resistance forces in Taiwan win the election, then President Tsai Ing-wen is basically left spinning in the wind.
This is a major dilemma for U.S. imperialism, and I would point your audience to an intriguing article in the New York Times Magazine yesterday that pointed to October 7th, 2022, as a date as important as the special military operation of February 2022. Insofar as the former date, October 2022, supposedly, according to the journalists, signaled the launching of what amounts to a war against China. That is to say, seeking to suffocate the Chinese economy by cutting off chips, computer chips, which go into your smartphones, to your cars, and increasingly everywhere, including hotel rooms, believe it or not. And Taiwan, as noted, TSMC is a major manufacturer of these chips. Their arm has been twisted, and they're building a major plant in Arizona. But still, there is distinct possibility that if these elections do not go the right way for U.S. imperialism in early 2024, that the new leadership in Taiwan will cut a deal with China, which will put more wind in the Chinese sail. And in any case, I'm not even sure if this strategy of trying to suffocate the Chinese economy by cutting off chips and putting pressure on Japan and Taiwan and the Netherlands, too, by the way, which may have played a role in the recent being forced out of office of the leader of Mark Rutte, who was forced out of office just a few days ago because of manifold problems. It's not even clear if that strategy is going to be sufficient because China may be too far down the road technologically. For example, with regard to quantum computing, with regard to electric vehicles, that talking about suffocating Chinese economy is basically a fool's errand. And in any case, pay a close attention to an article in today's newspaper that suggests that Japan is getting cold feet with regard to joining U.S. imperialism in terms of a military resistance to China over Taiwan. It's not surprising because there's a lot of anti-Yankee sentiment in Japan, stretching not only back to the U.S. atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, but even before then, before the Pacific War, when Imperial Japan was seeking closer relations with Black America, which some say led to the atomic bombing of Japan.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, as always, and we look forward to having you back.